The morning sun cast golden ripples across Willowbrook Lake as I carried my 2 kayaks down the familiar wooden dock. This had been my ritual for 3 years. Every Saturday at dawn, I'd slip my bright yellow sea kayak and my smaller red fishing kayak into the pristine waters that served as the crown jewel of our exclusive Willowbrook Estates community. The HOA had marketed this place as a waterfront paradise, and for the most part, it had lived up to that promise. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm a hydrological engineer by trade, a detail that would prove more significant than anyone could have imagined. I'd moved to Willowbrook after my divorce, seeking the kind of peaceful solitude that only comes from gliding across still water at sunrise, watching herons fish in the shallows while the rest of the world still slept. The community was upscale but not ostentatious, with 53 custom homes arranged around the 12-acre lake like a carefully planned amphitheater. The trouble began 3 months ago when Eleanor Hartwell was elected as the new HOA president. Eleanor was a retired corporate lawyer with steel gray hair pulled back in a perpetual bun and the kind of personality that could freeze water at 20 paces. She'd run on a platform of restoring order and property values, which I'd naively assumed meant fixing the playground equipment and updating the landscaping. I should have known better when she started her first board meeting by announcing, "There's been far too much laxity and rule enforcement around here. We need to get back to basics." The basics, as it turned out, included a comprehensive review of all existing activities around the lake. Eleanor had apparently spent her first weeks in office walking the perimeter with a measuring tape and a thick binder of HOA regulations, some dating back to the community's founding in 1987. She discovered that while kayaking was mentioned as a permitted activity in the original covenants, there were specific guidelines about storage, registration, and usage that had been largely ignored by previous boards. "Mr. Chen," she'd said during the September board meeting, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to boardroom battles, "I notice you've been storing watercraft on the community dock without proper registration." I'd looked around the room at the other board members, Bob Martinez, the retired accountant who'd served as treasurer for 8 years, Sarah Kim, the pediatrician who'd joined the board to advocate for better playground safety, and newcomer, James Tucker, a young lawyer who'd moved in just 6 months ago and seemed eager to make his mark. Their expressions ranged from uncomfortable to apologetic. "I've been keeping my kayaks there for 3 years, I'd replied, trying to keep my voice level. "The previous board said it was fine as long as I kept them neat and secured." Eleanor had flipped through her binder with theatrical precision. "I don't see any documentation of that permission. According to Section 12.3 of our covenants, all watercraft must be registered with the HOA, display current registration decals, and be stored in designated areas only. Your kayaks appear to violate all 3 requirements." The thing about Eleanor was that she wasn't technically wrong. Like many HOA covenants, ours were written broadly enough to cover almost any conceivable situation, with enforcement left to the discretion of the board. Previous boards had operated on a philosophy of, if it's not hurting anyone, let it slide. Eleanor, however, seemed to view every overlooked rule as a personal affront to the natural order. "I'd be happy to register them," I'd offered. "What's the process?" "There is no current registration process," she'd replied with what I swear was a hint of satisfaction. "The board will need to develop new procedures for watercraft registration, storage fees, and compliance monitoring. Until then, I'm afraid all unregistered watercraft will need to be removed from community property." Sarah Kim had spoken up then. Bless her heart. "Eleanor, couldn't we grandfather in existing arrangements while we work out the new rules? Marcus has been a model resident, and his kayaks are well maintained and properly secured." "Rules are rules, Dr. Kim," Eleanor had replied icily. "We can't have different standards for different residents. That's how communities fall into disrepair." I'd left that meeting frustrated but not overly concerned. I figured I'd move my kayaks to my garage temporarily while the board worked out reasonable registration procedures. But Eleanor, it seemed, was just getting started. 2 weeks later, I received a formal violation notice in my mailbox. Not hand-delivered or discussed, but sent through certified mail like I was some kind of delinquent. The letter, printed on official HOA letterhead, informed me that my kayaks were in violation of community covenants and must be removed within 72 hours or face additional penalties. The penalties, as outlined in the letter, were surprisingly harsh. $50 per day for each day the violation continued, with the potential for the HOA to remove the items at the owner's expense if compliance wasn't achieved within 2 weeks. I'd called Eleanor directly, hoping to resolve things amicably. "Mrs. Hartwell, I got your letter about the kayaks. I'm happy to move them, but I was hoping we could discuss the registration process you mentioned. I've been doing some research, and most HOAs with similar rules have pretty straightforward procedures." "Mr. Chen," she'd interrupted, "the board is still reviewing options for watercraft management. Until we've established proper protocols, no unregistered watercraft can remain on community property. I trust that's clear enough." "Of course, but when do you think the board might—" "Good day, Mr. Chen." The line had gone dead, leaving me staring at my phone in disbelief. I'd dealt with difficult clients in my engineering career, but Eleanor's combination of rigid adherence to rules and complete inflexibility was something else entirely. I'd moved my kayaks that afternoon, loading them onto my truck and storing them in my garage with a mixture of annoyance and resignation. But the incident had sparked something in me, a curiosity about just how extensive Eleanor's rule enforcement campaign might be. Over the next month, I'd watched her systematic approach unfold like a masterclass in bureaucratic overreach. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow in the corner house, received a violation notice for her bird feeders. Apparently, they attracted nuisance wildlife and violated landscaping guidelines. The Johnsons were cited for their children's playground equipment, which was deemed non-conforming architectural elements, despite being a simple swing set. Even Bob Martinez found himself on the receiving end of Eleanor's attention when she determined that his vegetable garden violated the ornamental landscaping-only clause in the covenants. Each violation followed the same pattern: certified mail, 72-hour compliance deadline, escalating daily fines, and the threat of HOA initiated. Removal at the owner's expense. Most residents simply complied, not wanting the hassle or the financial burden of fighting the system. But I could see the community changing, becoming more tense and watchful. Neighbors who used to wave and chat now hurried past each other, afraid that any deviation from Eleanor's interpretation of perfection might result in their own violation notice. The final straw came on a crisp October morning when I decided to put my kayaks back in the water for what I figured might be one of the last good paddling days of the season. I'd been storing them in my garage for 6 weeks, and Eleanor had made no progress on establishing registration procedures despite repeated requests for updates at board meetings. I'd loaded the kayaks onto my truck before dawn, planning to spend a few hours on the water before the afternoon wind picked up. As I pulled into the community parking area near the lake, I noticed Eleanor's white BMW already parked there, unusual for 6 a.m. on a Saturday, but not unprecedented. She'd taken to conducting what she called compliance patrols at various times of day, documenting violations with a digital camera and a notepad. I'd unloaded my kayaks and was carrying the first one toward the dock when Eleanor appeared from behind the maintenance shed like some kind of suburban specter. "Mr. Chen, stop right there." Her voice carried clearly across the morning stillness. "Those watercraft are not authorized for use on community property." I'd set the kayak down carefully, trying to maintain my composure. "Mrs. Hartwell, I understand. The registration issue is still being worked out by the board. I was hoping to get a few hours on the water this morning." "Absolutely not." She'd approached with her camera already raised, snapping photos like I was some kind of environmental disaster. "You were explicitly told that unregistered watercraft are prohibited on community property. This is a clear and willful violation of HOA covenants." Look, I've been patient about this whole registration thing, but it's been 6 weeks and the board hasn't even discussed specific procedures. I'm happy to follow whatever rules you establish, but in the meantime, you'll comply with existing regulations or face the consequences. There had been something in her tone, a smugness, a barely concealed delight, that finally pushed me over the edge. This wasn't about community standards or property values. This was about power, pure and simple. Eleanor had found a way to control her neighbors through selective enforcement of arcane rules, and she was enjoying every minute of it. "Fine," I'd said, loading my kayaks back onto the truck. "But I'm going to start attending every board meeting until this gets resolved properly." "You're certainly welcome to do that, Mr. Chen. Democracy in action." But the opportunity came on a Tuesday morning in late November, 3 weeks after I'd made my decision to take action. Eleanor had called an emergency board meeting for that evening to discuss what she'd termed escalating compliance issues in the community. The agenda, posted on the community bulletin board with typical Eleanor efficiency, included discussions about new enforcement procedures, increased violation fines, and the establishment of a community standards patrol program. I'd spent those 3 weeks preparing meticulously, using my engineering background to understand every aspect of the lake's water management system. What I'd discovered during multiple after-dark reconnaissance missions had exceeded my wildest expectations. The maintenance building wasn't just a storage shed, it was the nerve center of an incredibly sophisticated system that most residents, including Eleanor, had no idea existed. The original developers had built redundancy into everything. The manual drainage controls I'd spotted in the engineering drawings were connected to a network of valves, gates, and channels that could divert water in multiple directions. During heavy rains, excess water could be routed to storm drains that fed into the municipal system. During drought conditions, the lake could be supplemented from city water supplies. And in emergency situations, such as dam maintenance or safety concerns, the entire lake could be drained in a matter of hours. The key to everything was a control panel inside the maintenance building, protected by nothing more sophisticated than a master lock that had probably been installed during the Clinton administration. I'd tested the lock mechanism during one of my midnight scouting trips, and it had taken me exactly 4 minutes to pick it using techniques I'd learned from a locksmith friend during my college years. But breaking into the maintenance building was only the beginning. What I'd found inside had been like discovering a secret control room for the entire community's most prized amenity. The control panel was a marvel of 1980s engineering: analog gauges, mechanical switches, and a series of valve controls that looked like they belonged on a Navy submarine. A laminated instruction sheet, yellowed with age, provided step-by-step procedures for various scenarios: normal operations, storm event management, maintenance draining, and ominously, emergency evacuation. I'd photographed every switch, gauge, and instruction, studying them at home until I could operate the system blindfolded. The process for draining the lake was surprisingly straightforward. Close the municipal water inlet, open the primary drainage valves, and activate the emergency pumps that would accelerate the process. According to the specifications, complete drainage would take approximately 6 to 8 hours, depending on the starting water level. The genius of the system was that it had been designed to be reversible. Once drained, the lake could be refilled, using the same municipal connection, though that process would take significantly longer, probably 2 to 3 days for complete restoration. But here's where Eleanor's obsession with rules and regulations was about to bite her in ways she never could have imagined. I'd spent considerable time researching the legal and regulatory framework surrounding our community lake. What I'd discovered was a bureaucratic nightmare that made Eleanor's HOA enforcement look simple by comparison. The lake existed under a complex web of permits involving the State Environmental Agency, the County Water Management District, the Municipal Stormwater Authority, and something called the State Dam Safety Commission. Most importantly, I'd learned that any significant alteration to the lake's water level was supposed to be reported to multiple agencies within 24 hours, especially if it might affect downstream water users or environmental conditions. The original permits included specific language about maintaining minimum flow rates in the creek below the dam during certain seasons to protect fish habitats. Eleanor, for all her rulebook fanaticism, apparently had no idea about any of these requirements. The HOA had been operating the lake as a private amenity for decades without considering the broader regulatory implications. They'd never filed the required annual reports, never updated their permits after changes in state regulations, and never conducted the mandatory environmental assessments that current law required. In other words, our pristine community lake was a regulatory violation of epic proportions, one that Eleanor's own enforcement philosophy would demand immediate, and harsh correction. The night before the emergency board meeting, I'd made my final preparations. I'd drafted a detailed letter to every relevant regulatory agency, explaining my concerns about potential environmental and safety violations related to the lake's operation. I'd included photographs of the aging dam structure, copies of outdated permits, and references to the various regulations that appeared to be violated. The letters were sealed, stamped, and ready to mail, but I'd held off sending them, hoping that some last-minute miracle might make my planned course of action unnecessary. That miracle didn't come. The emergency board meeting was everything I'd expected and worse. Eleanor had transformed the community clubhouse into something resembling a courtroom, with the board seated at a long table facing rows of chairs for residents. She'd even prepared a PowerPoint presentation outlining her vision for enhanced community enforcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," she'd begun, clicking through slides that looked like they'd been designed for a corporate restructuring, "it's time to acknowledge that our community has been operating under a culture of permissiveness that threatens our property values and quality of life." Her presentation included photographs of various violations throughout the community: Mrs. Patterson's bird feeders, the Johnson's swing set, someone's holiday decorations that had apparently been left up 3 days past the acceptable deadline. Each photo was accompanied by the relevant covenant section and proposed penalty structure. "Effective immediately," Eleanor had continued, "we'll be implementing a 3-strike system for covenant violations. First violation results in a warning and mandatory compliance within 48 hours. Second violation incurs a $200 fine and requires written remediation plan. Third violation results in a $500 fine and potential legal action for covenant enforcement." The room had erupted in protests. Bob Martinez, the longtime treasurer, had actually stood up and interrupted her. "Eleanor, this is insane. We're talking about neighbors here, not criminal defendants. These kinds of fines will destroy the community spirit we've worked years to build." "Mr. Martinez," Eleanor had replied with icy precision, "community spirit doesn't pay for maintenance, legal fees, or property improvements. Consistent enforcement of reasonable standards does." Dr. Kim had tried a different approach. "What about establishing an appeals process? Some kind of review board for residents who feel they've been unfairly cited?" "Dr. Kim, the covenants are not matters of opinion. Either a violation exists or it doesn't. Appeals processes just create opportunities for favoritism and inconsistent enforcement." That's when James Tucker, the young lawyer who'd joined the board 6 months earlier, had spoken up with something that chilled me to the bone. "Actually, I've been reviewing our enforcement capabilities, and I think Eleanor's approach doesn't go far enough. Our covenants include provisions for placing liens on properties with chronic violations. We could potentially force the sale of non-compliant properties if residents refuse to cooperate with community standards." The room had gone completely silent. Even Eleanor had looked surprised by the suggestion, though not displeased. "That's an interesting point, James," she'd said slowly. "Perhaps we should explore the full range of enforcement tools available to us." I'd sat there listening to my neighbors being threatened with the loss of their homes over bird feeders and playground equipment, and something inside me had snapped. These people weren't protecting community standards. They were destroying everything that made this place worth living in. As the meeting had broken up amid angry murmurs and worried conversations, I'd made eye contact with Eleanor across the room. She'd smiled at me, that same predatory expression I'd seen when she'd seized my kayaks, and I'd realized that she viewed the community's fear and anger as validation of her approach. That night, I'd mailed my letters to the regulatory agencies, but more importantly, I'd set my alarm for 3 a.m. The pre-dawn hours on Wednesday were perfect for what I had planned. No moon, overcast sky, and the kind of November chill that kept even the most dedicated early risers indoors. I'd dressed in dark clothing and brought a small flashlight, though I'd memorized the layout of the maintenance building well enough to work in complete darkness if necessary. The walk from my house to the lake took exactly 12 minutes along, the winding paths that connected our community. I'd timed it multiple times during my planning phase, identifying the route that offered the most concealment and the fewest sightlines from neighboring houses. The maintenance building sat in its grove of pine trees like a concrete bunker, invisible from the road and screened from most of the surrounding homes. I'd approached it from the back, where a gap in the tree line provided access without crossing any open areas. The master lock opened even more easily than it had during my practice sessions. Apparently, 30-plus years of weather and neglect had made the mechanism even more cooperative. The door swung open with only the SE